What's up, everyone? I'm going to be talking about James Toney and why I think he's quite overrated by his fans. And a lot of boxing fans have a tendency to overrate fighters like Manny Pacquiao, Floyd Mayweather, a couple of others. Even going back, there's a lot of fans of the sport like Roberto Duran fans who overrate Roberto Duran and make him out to be bigger than he actually is. And it's not these particular fighters. It's probably any fighter you have. You have fans who exaggerate how good the fighters they support are, and I think James Toney fans do exaggerate what James Toney did in his career quite a lot. And James Toney was, there's no doubting James Toney was a really, really good fighter. But at the same time, people keep on overlooking a lot of stuff. Like James Toney, he went up in weight class. He went up from middleweight to heavyweight, and he won titles between middleweight, a super middleweight, and a cruiserweight. But he didn't win titles. He didn't win a title at light heavyweight, and he didn't win a title at heavyweight. And along the way, early on in his career, he had some decent wins. He beat some decent contenders out there, and when he actually finally stepped it up, when he actually fought in his first championship fight, he fought Michael Nunn, and Michael Nunn was a pound for pound level fighter at the time. He was a really good middleweight, and James Toney knocked him out. But people tend to forget what happened prior to that knockout, that Michael Nunn was outboxing James Toney. And even throughout his career, like, James Toney had a lot of close wins. Like, following the Michael Nunn fight, Reggie Johnson was knocked James Toney down, and actually won a lot of rounds against James Toney. And some people actually felt that Reggie Johnson deserved a win against James Toney. And it wasn't just Reggie Johnson; it was Mike McCallum as well. Mike McCallum was a career light middleweight, and he fought at middleweight, but he never really had the same success at middleweight as he did at light middleweight. Even though he beat some decent opponents at middleweight, he was never the same fighter at middleweight as he was at light middleweight. And in those three fights, they were extremely close fights. And each of those three fights, you could score them either way. You could score them for either Toney or Mike McCallum. But let's not forget, Mike McCallum was kind of old at that stage of his career when he fought James Toney. I think in the first fight he was about 34, 35 years old, and in the second fight he was probably like 35, 36. And then when he fought again at light heavyweight, even then it was really competitive, and it was a pretty close affair between James Toney and Mike McCallum. So I don't get how like a guy who's seen as an all-time great in boxing can struggle with fighters like you're supposed to be, you're supposed to, in my view, you're supposed to have a clear win over these guys, but you're not supposed to have like dubious wins over a lot of them. And not only that, there was one middleweight called Dave Tiberi who was robbed against James Toney, and you can watch that fight on YouTube. James Toney, I think he had weight problems, and he moved up in weight after that fight. He moved up to 168 after that fight. But Dave Tiberi was giving it to Toney. He was hurting Toney, and James Toney deserved to lose that fight. And I think even everybody was surprised when they heard the decision. The fight's on YouTube, you can see it. And like, for me, it's like you can't struggle like this and expect to, like, be seen as some kind of great. Like guys in the past, like I don't think they had the same issues Toney did. Like they were keeping them. They had stay busy fights like James Toney had. They were fighting like club level fighters. They were fighting journeyman fighters in between the championship fights. But when they got to the championship fights, they were winning those fights. They were struggling, but then they were winning the fights either by knockout or sometimes by clear decision. And and if it was ever close, it was against someone really, really good. It wasn't against a contender at the time. And yeah, I agree that James Toney has some really good wins on his record, but let's not exaggerate those wins. I mean, his wins against Aaron Barkley. Aaron Barkley was a good fighter, yeah. But he was knocked out in a round by Nigel Benn. And, James Toney, he put on a really good display of boxing, but Aaron Barkley, a win against Aaron Barkley doesn't elevate you to this some kind of like Academy Award winning status. So I really think, people need to calm down, and like people really need to look at his career quite objectively. And even later on in his career, when he fought Vasily Jurov, I thought that fight was a close fight and it could have gone Vasily Jurov's way. But Vasily Jurov was throwing a lot of punches and was more active than James Toney, and you can score it. You could score that fight on activity, but the judges on that night scored it on Toney's crisper punching and maybe Toney's defensive boxing. And I can see why many of James Toney's fans respect James Toney so much. I mean, he moved, like, as I've already mentioned, he's moved up in so many weight divisions to heavyweight. But it's not like he was the majority of the times he was fighting club level fighters, and he was fighting journeyman level fighters. Even though he has a decent amount of wins, it's not enough to justify you. It's not enough to justify you as an all-time great. It doesn't give you. It doesn't make you that. It doesn't define you. It means you were staying active and you were incorporating the old school into your game, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And he was keeping himself active. That's great. But what really matters is the quality of wins, not the quantity of wins. And even when he went up to heavyweight, I mean, people talk about the win over Evander Holyfield. I mean, Evander Holyfield was coming off a loss against Chris Bird when he fought James Toney. Evander Holyfield was a 40-year-old man, and yeah, James Toney knocked him out. Like, big deal. It's not like he knocked out, like, he didn't stop a prime version of Evander Holyfield. Like, he didn't stop the Riddick Bowe version of Evander Holyfield or the Mike Tyson version of Evander Holyfield. He stopped a pretty old Evander Holyfield who was 40 years old and who was coming off a loss against Chris Bird. I mean, yeah, it's a good win, but it's not the type of win where you're actually beating a young fighter in his prime. And this brings me on to my next comment. James Toney was, when he fought Roy Jones Jr. Roy Jones Jr. was in his prime. He was a young fighter. Had James Toney beaten Roy Jones Jr., I could see why so many of his fans would say, yeah, he was really one of the best fighters out there. He was really, really good. But instead what happened was that Roy Jones Jr. outclassed him over 12 rounds. There wasn't one round in that fight you could score for James Toney. He was completely outclassed. And you could blame that, I don't know how much you can blame that on conditioning or whatever, but a guy who's proclaiming to be some kind of great at super middleweight or middleweight, he should have at least made that fight, in my opinion, a little bit competitive, but instead he was completely whitewashed by Roy Jones Jr. And even after that fight, he fought Montel Griffin, and I think the first fight, he lost the first fight, and in the second fight, a lot of people say he was robbed. But, Montel Griffin, that's another example of a fighter who isn't like, who doesn't have that great talent. He's a talented fighter, he's a championship level fighter, but he's not the fighter who you should be like, you should be competitive, but you would get a clear decision over him. And yet again, we see Toney struggling with Montel Griffin. And even though the second fight was, it was a close fight, but I thought Toney won that fight. But the judges, I think the judges scored it to Montel Griffin. and that J- I think I'll that's it right there. And I think Toney, I think Toney like is a good fighter, but he's not a great fighter. And there was if he actually fought some fighters if he was at 160 and if he fought Salam Kalambe, um, the I think Kalambe would have beaten Toney. I honestly think Kalambe would have beaten Toney. And it's like he has a good resume of opponents, and he fought continuously, and I respect that. But when people seem to get it out of hand when they say, yeah, James Toneys could have fought in any era and he would have beaten so and so, he would have given Marvin Hagler a really tough night. And if I'm honest, I think style wise, I think Joe Calzaghe's volume punching style, I think it would be a stylistic nightmare for someone like James Toney. But that's just my opinion. But James Toney, he was, without doubt, he was a very very talented fighter, and I think he could have done more with his career, because I think a lot of people say he didn't really take his career so seriously, and I think this may have resulted in a lot of lackluster performances against maybe top level opposition. But with that said, I think I'll end the video right here, because I think my rant is over. Please do comment, please do rate my video, and just tell me what you think about James Toney, because I think it's an interesting topic. And I guess I'll do another video on another fighter. I think my last two videos, even this video, I've been criticizing fighters a lot. So I think I'll try and big up a fighter in my next video. Try and say something positive for a change instead of being too overly critical. But with that said, I think I'll leave it there. So see you later, guys and girls.